IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat. Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. I'm Manoj Kewalramani, and today I have with me my colleagues Prateek, Waghre and Rohan, Seth. And we're going to be talking about the changing nature of web advertising, or the potentially changing nature of web advertising, with talk about Google now wanting to do away with third-party cookies, and how that impacts you and I from our privacy point of view, how that impacts advertisers and the rest of it. So we're going to try and unpack all of this over the next 20 to 30 minutes. So firstly, guys, welcome to this conversation.
Hello.
Hi, Manoj.
Okay, so I want to start with you, Prateek. Firstly, tell me, let's sort of unpack this, okay? Because this stuff can be really, really strange for people who don't really know about it. And I mean, even people in the field often don't really know about how some of these systems work. So let's just first unpack this idea of web advertising. Apart from it being terribly annoying, because you're constantly bombarded with stuff on your web page every time you open up, how does web advertising work? How do advertisers decide whom they want to target, why they want to target? What are they sort of looking at? Because there are times where I wonder that I've thought about diapers and I start getting a diaper ads on my browser. So how does all this really work?
Yeah, fair enough. So let's start it. So there are three main entities you should consider. The first is the advertiser, which is basically brands that want to advertise to you, right? The Nike trying to sell you shoes, your local neighborhood store trying to sell you something, etc. Right? Then you have your publishers, which is essentially any website that a user accesses, right? It can be a news website, it can be a blog, it can be anything, right? Now, what these publishers do is on their pages, they have places that they can display ads to anyone who comes and visits them, and that's typically called inventory, right? And what a publisher is essentially trying to do is sell that inventory, all right? And then now let's come to the third party, which is the user, which depending on which analogy you prefer is either the raw material or the product, and that's people like you and me going about our business on the website. So let's set us aside for now and come back to the publisher and the advertiser. So as I said, the publisher has inventory which they're trying to sell. All right. And why do they do that? Because they want to make money, obviously. Now, there are a couple of ways they can do this. For large publishers, yes, they can potentially enter directly into deals with brands to say that, okay, I'll display your advertisement on my banner or on so and so part of my page. Right. But that's not an option for the overwhelming majority of publishers on websites. So then what they try to do is to sell that inventory and target users specifically based on their interests. And this is what now gives rise to this whole field of ad tech, right? It's a deep industry with a lot of different moving parts. So while we won't get into all of these specifically, there's an interesting industry landscape document that Lumascape puts out. So we'll put a note of, we'll link that just to get a sense of how complex this entire ecosystem is. But what this entire ecosystem is trying to do is trying to figure out which is the best ad to show a particular user. Right now, that then goes and creates incentives of trying and tracking users, understanding everything they're doing, getting a sense of what type of websites they visited, etc. All to then show them an ad in real time, right? Which is the first time as soon as I come to a page, it will then immediately spark off an auction where different advertisers or different exchanges that advertisers tend to work through will bid will bid into that. Okay, so saying that, okay, I will pay so much for this inventory to target this particular user, right? And then the winning bid ultimately displays that ad on the page. And the beauty of this ad tech industry is that it's extremely complex. It gets reported on as a trade beat extensively, but we don't see a lot of these conversations breaking through into mainstream coverage, which is really surprising given how much of an impact it has, right? I think we've all come to the acknowledgement that the way platforms work, their business models are at the core of a lot of problems. And despite that, this entire industry doesn't get the type of attention or coverage in the mainstream press that it should.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, there's very little reported about this. There's very little discussed, and it's fascinating how rapidly this data is crunched, how rapidly then these bids, like you're explaining, happen, and how often it can be incredibly, it can be incredibly poorly targeted also. This is just me talking based on some of the ads that I end up seeing based on my search history. But it can also be really, really just the rapid nature of purchases from certain places, or just a look at something can then generate certain kinds of ads. And if you're a little bit careful about the kind of ads that you're seeing online when you're browsing, you end up realizing where this is coming from and why this is coming from. So no, it's fascinating. I agree. I think there should be a lot more examination of how this industry operates.
And that's actually a way, what you touched on, right, about the effectiveness. That's actually an open conversation that keeps popping up every now and then in terms of how effective this really is, right? And there was recently a very interesting book called The Subprime Attention Crisis, which sort of compares this to the subprime financial crisis of 2008, right? And it talks about how attention has been commoditized, and how these ad markets have so much opacity, and and people operate on such skewed incentives that it's creating a bubble that's waiting to explode or burst, right? But why that matters is because, for all the ills of the advertising model, right, it is what has heavily subsidized the growth of the internet. The internet as we know it today would not have happened if it wasn't for the ad supported model taking off the way it did. So interestingly, Ethan Zuckman calls it the original sin of the internet.
Yeah, no, fascinating. Rohan?
Hey, I want to add a little bit about Google's place in this ecosystem. As Prateek has said, advertising is a pretty complex ecosystem, and I'll just give you a little example of how this thing works. This is also in my newsletter called "Hand Me the Paper." I think everyone here saw that coming, but basically, let's say you have an advertiser, right, like Ford, who wants to advertise on a news website, like let's say the Print, right? So Google connects Ford and the Print through this place called an ad exchange. So for large advertisers, this place is called AdX, right? So Ford uses an ad buying tool to connect to the exchange. On the other side, the Print connects to the exchange using an ad server tool. And before the Print's website finishes loading, you've got an ad buying tool and ad server tool interacting on an exchange. And before you know it, you're looking at a Ford ad in case you're looking to buy a car, Manoj, in case those are the ads that have been targeted to you. And the problem here is Google sort of owns the ad buying tool, it owns the ad server tool, it owns the exchange on which these transactions are taking place. It also owns the browser that generates cookies that sort of help make these transactions possible. So that is sort of where we are at right now, and all of this advertising ecosystem is just dominated in every sense of the word by this one company, and also there's Facebook. So yeah.
Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about two of the things that you've mentioned, right, Rohan, which is Google and its role, and of course, cookies, which is where we sort of began, which is where I began this conversation with. And I want to first try and, because a lot of people will obviously know what cookies are, but a lot of people will not know what cookies are, but they would have definitely heard of them because as you're browsing, you keep getting asked the question for permission often at different places. So I want, Prateek, you to first explain to me what exactly is a cookie in this online parlance.
Yeah, okay. It's a very, so it goes back to the early days of the internet, right? Now a lot of the internet as we know, or as it functioned back then, was stateless in the sense that it doesn't remember what to do, right? You come to a website, you open a page, there's no concept of a login, it has no idea who you are, you just consume information and you go away, right? Over time there was a need to start then identifying people coming back, what they did on websites, and that sort of thing. And that's essentially where the cookie came in. It was essentially basically a text file that stored information about you and what you did on the website, right? In its earliest form, it was meant to be on a particular website. And of course, over time, people also realized that it can be used to track what you do across websites, right? And that's where the third party cookie came in. And a lot of the advertising industry is then built off the use of this third party cookie, which is not just tracking what you do on one particular website, but tracking it across a whole bunch of websites, right? A very interesting example of this is, so if you go to typically most news websites, right, news publication websites, if you scroll to the bottom of an article, they all have this tabula outbrain box, right? Which is then showing you some very suspicious content from different parts of the internet, right? And so that's an example of a third party cookie. It's tracking you across different websites, then trying to serve content to you, right? Whether it's ads in the traditional sense, or in this specific example, it's trying to push you towards content to another publisher's website, right? Who will then probably be paying tabula outbrain for incoming traffic that they get.
Okay, so it's essentially something where it's documenting what I'm doing on different websites, and like you said, even sort of third-party basis, and then it's sort of trying to direct me based on what my preferences are and how another provider or an advertiser can target their content to me, and this sort of serves that purpose. I mean, it sounds fairly. I can see the problems obviously with cookies and why we need to eventually give permissions to sort of record some of this data. But why is there the privacy sort of aspect of this is quite clear, right? I mean, it depends on what exactly you're tracking, how much data you're gathering,
Yeah.
and what sort of profile you can build of me as an individual. But and I'm sure you can explain to me a little bit more about the privacy aspect of it. But I want to understand, often now when we browse websites, we get asked for consent. Websites will ask you, right? That we store cookies, blah blah blah. Do you agree to it? 99.9% of the times, and I'm probably being a little generous here by saying 99.9%. I think it's really 100%. People don't really even read that, and they just say accept.
Yeah.
And you go ahead and say whatever you want to store, because the understanding is that you're anyway going to do it, or somebody's anyway going to do it. So, and I need this content, so I don't really care. So, firstly, what sort of privacy implications are there? And secondly, is this idea of informed consent, any of this in this context, even valid? I mean, from an individual's point of view.
Can I take that?
Sure.
I think there's a few things that I would like to say here. The first one is I think Prateek's made this distinction well, but let me just add on to it. So there's three kind of cookies, right? There's the first party cookie, there's a second party cookie, and the third party cookie. Right? First party cookies are basically data collected by the website that you're visiting, right? So if you're on Wall Street Journal, let's say the Wall Street Journal will collect data about what you're doing on the website and how many clicks you've made and so on and so forth. Second party cookies are transferred from one company to another company through some sort of data partnership. And the third party cookies are collected by advertisers and so on. So this is typically what your ad blocker is going to block is your third party cookies. That data point about 99.9% of people clicking accept, which it's actually, so there is some research that's been done in the wake of GDPR. And so GDPR actually has very clear ideas on how consent should operate. And so there's been a study by the National Bureau of Economic Research, and what it says is that before the GDPR's version of consent and the ability to opt out came in, people had been using stuff like cookie deletions and ad blockers and so on to sort of make sure that their privacy was being protected against advertisers. What this basically did was that it made extremely short-lived users on websites. So, for example, a website has been recording how often you come. But if you delete your cookies and use an ad blocker and so on, then every time you come, the website thinks it's a new user that's coming. Right? And so this is an imperfect sort of means to protect your privacy. What the GDPR allows users to do is to say, I would like to opt out of this. So there is no data collection happening in the first place. And according to the study, around 12.5% of the people actually went in for the opt-out version. So it's more like, what's 100 minus 12.5? It's
around 87.5%.
87.5. So 87.5% of the people are clicking accept. 12.5% of the users are saying, I would like to opt out of this. The privacy implications of cookies, well, the way to describe this is that advertising is a form of discrimination. It discriminates you on the basis of a bunch of things and then targets ads to you. And if you're doing that, then by definition, you're sort of encroaching on my privacy and you're sort of clubbing me with people and making judgments about me and then sending me a bunch of ads that I may or may not want. So yeah, that's the basic lay of the land. And so this is why this concept of a privacy sandbox of FLoC is quite interesting, because Google sort of, as Prateek said, has recognized that this is a challenge, because Safari itself by default turns off third-party cookies, as does Firefox. And so Google's come up with this new thing called Federated Learning of Cohorts, which is sort of meant to be a new way to make your browser do the profiling that third-party cookies used to do themselves. In this case, this will boil down your recent browsing history into a behavioral label and then share that with websites and advertisers instead of your whole profile.
We'll come to that. We'll come to that, and we'll try and sort of unpack that a little bit. But Prateek, I wanted to get your thoughts on the idea of how, firstly, again, like I said, Rohan's explained what cookies do and why they do certain things, but a little bit about from the point of view of privacy, the privacy implications for people, and obviously how serious are the sort of privacy implications in that sense, because like we're saying, okay, not 99.9 but at least 87.5% of people, even after being asked, basically say okay. So how serious are these implications, or how serious can they be?
Yeah, so Rohan actually touched upon a very interesting point, right? Let me just build off that, which is about if you delete cookies when you go back to a website, you're a new user, right? Now think of it from an advertising or a publisher's perspective, right? They stand to lose a lot from just a simple act of deleting a cookie, right? They don't want to lose the profile that they've built of individuals just because someone goes and deletes cookies, right? So so this incentive structure doesn't stop at cookie, right? Because that's when they resort to things like fingerprinting, right? Which is based on your browser trying to find anything that is unique that can separate you from a crowd, right? Which can be right down to the font you use, to the size of your window, to certain settings that you're using, right? So this concept of tracking everything you do and everything about you, right, together is what then creates these massive privacy implications for individuals using the internet.
So this is interesting. I think I need to sit down with you later and I need to figure out what are the kinds of things that they track so that I can make sure that I keep altering those so that I can keep going through porous paywalls and access content. But
it's a losing battle.
It's a losing battle, fair enough. Okay, so let's get to what Google is doing. And Rohan sort of alluded to it already, this idea of FLoC. Firstly, again, Rohan's mentioned the fact that Firefox and Safari have stopped using third-party cookies, and Google's now proposing this FLoC. I think it's proposed it some time ago. But explain to us firstly, what exactly is FLoC? What is Google doing, and why is it doing this?
Yeah. Okay. So this goes back a little bit, right? So in 2019 is basically when Google announced this project of Privacy Sandbox, right? Which is not one technology per se, but it's a bunch of standards that they're trying to develop, which will preserve some of the ways that the advertising ecosystem works while addressing some of the privacy violations and privacy concerns around it. Now, as part of that, there are a number of different standards that they've proposed. Interestingly, many of them are bird themed. FLoC is one. There are others like pigeon, fledge. I think my favorite is parakeet, which is private anonymized requests for ads that keep efficacy and enhance transparency. Right? So there's this whole bunch of proposals of things that they're trying to push. Now, as Rohan said, right, with what FLoC is essentially doing, or Federated Learning of Cohorts, it's trying to group people by their behaviors, right? And one of the other interesting things that it also aims to do. So, a common question about this was, look, if you're still grouping by, you're still grouping me, right? So there is still some level of targeting. So what Google's position on this is twofold, right? One is that it's going to be user based, or it's going to be group based. They're not tracking individuals. And as part of the recent announcement, the other commitment that they made was that they are neither going to build nor support any of the upcoming workarounds, to these proposals that will enable individual targeting. Right. So it's twofold. One is the fact that they rolled out FLoC in some form of tests, and the other was the commitment to the fact that they will not build or support any systems that enable individual targeting. Right now, the way the FLoC themselves work is also interesting, because one key distinction is, and Rohan alluded to the ad server earlier, right? One of the proposals of FLoC also is that instead of this transaction now happening on a centralized server somewhere else, they are moving that decision process to your browser, right? So it's not happening somewhere else where someone can track you. It's happening within your browser, right? And these FLoC cohorts typically last only for a week. So it's addressing the risk of long-term tracking to some extent, but while ostensibly giving people the ability to target you by behaviors, right? So to that extent, the idea is that the concerns of it being targeted individually will be addressed, However, there are a lot of questions about this because a lot of things about the proposal are still up in the air. They aren't really finalized or decided. And then there are other aspects to consider, right? One is that this is specifically for third party information, right? So Google still has the most amount of first party information on you, right? The other thing that this does is now it incentivizes various publishers and different websites to also to improve or enhance the amount of first party information they collect about users, right? Now what kind of incentive that's going to create is also something that we have to see, how it plays out. And the other aspect is that, for websites, so for a lot of websites, they still have ways to identify you, right? You're typically logged in to some form of user ID, which is normally linked to an email or maybe a Facebook ID, right? So it's still, they websites can still potentially tie that back to your behavior in the group and identify you individually, right? So while it is a step forward towards privacy in some ways, it's not without its flaws.
Right. Fascinating. I mean, I have a couple of thoughts, but Rohan, I want to first get your thoughts, and then I'll sort of ask some of my really noob questions on this. Rohan?
All right. I don't think there are any new questions, Manoj. But let me sort of talk about the big trade-off that I see here. So basically, a browser that uses FLoC will collect information about the user's browsing habits and then use that information to assign the user to a cohort. Right? The browser will then share a cohort ID and will indicate what group a user belongs to, and at least a few thousand users will be in each cohort. If there's not a few thousand users in each cohort, then the cohorts will be combined to sort of make sure that there is at least some critical mass there, right? But my point here is that I'm not sure how many cohorts there are going to be. I imagine there's going to be a shit ton of cohorts, but there's a bit of a trade-off because the more cohorts you have, the more specific they are going to be. The less cohorts you have, the less specific and less useful those cohorts are going to be for advertisers. I don't think there is actually a sweet spot here because how, as an advertiser, I would want to have more specific cohorts that sort of gives you the most bang for my buck. But on the other hand, I would like to have more privacy and be part of a larger cohort so that I'm not always being targeted. So that's sort of the big trade-off I see. The other thing that we've talked about is that cohorts will be recalculated on a weekly basis, and each time the recalculation happens, this will use data from the previous week's browsing. So this sort of is less useful as a long-term identifier, but that also sort of makes this a more potent tool of how to gauge how users behave over time. So just I don't think this is as privacy preserving as this is made out to be. And the future of this is riddled with questions because let's say Google says we're not going to have sensitive cohorts. I don't exactly remember the name for it, Prateek. Maybe you can help me with that. But the basic idea is that we're not going to have cohorts of, let's say, just, I don't know, in the case of India, just say a cohort of Dalits, right? You don't want that to be a category for advertisers to target. But this is always going to be a moving target. And you're always going to have sensitive categories across cultures. I mean, in India, there is this. In Vietnam, maybe there's something else. In Cambodia, it's something else. And so this is always going to be a moving target. It may not actually be as safe as this is being made out to be. And of course, this has privacy implications. But my bigger concern is that this sensitive thing can really go out of hand. And also, there's no sweet spot between the cohort size. So those are the two sort of broad thoughts I had.
And I want to tie it back to the fingerprinting point also, right? Because since we did touch on that, the other thing to note is that today when a browser or when fingerprinting is happening, it's trying to identify you from a very large set of users. Within a FLoC, that gets easier because you're now narrowed down to a set of 1,000, 2,000, 10,000, whatever that FLoC size is. But so in some ways, it makes it a little bit easier for the fingerprinting to happen.
So I wanted to sort of ask a little bit about, and I can see that there is obviously there's lots of more clarity that's needed on this. But I mean, how do you sort of categorize people on behavior? Because I'm a little sort of yeah, you can use my location. You can perhaps, my browsing history might go from China related news to children's purchases to Bollywood gossip to really, really weird categories, right? So, which would make bunching me in some way for a content provider very, very difficult in many ways, right? How, or an advertiser, it would make it tricky to bunch me. I mean, you can use basic information where through my email, you've probably got my location, you've probably got my age, and some of that data. But how do you firstly bunch people in these cohorts? It's different when you're targeting individuals, but how do you create any sort of grouping on what basis? Is there any sort of clarity on that?
No, it remains a big, largely a question mark in the sense that it is going to be based on primarily your browsing history. But exactly as you pointed out, right? Browsing history is not going to make it that easy. So they're obviously going to push it through a bunch of machine learning systems to try and then segregate and create most logical groupings, I guess, that they can come up with. So interesting, right? As soon as this was announced, a whole bunch of users on AdTech Twitter went and started joking about the type of FLoCs they would be in, right? Based on their perceived behavior, right? And that got me thinking, because I would probably be in some domestic extremism kind of FLoC based on the type of browsing I do. So it remains to be seen how effective these groups are going to be, because there's no doubt that it's going to be highly imperfect, right? Just for the reason that you said, because people's browsing habits can be so varied, right? That it's going to be, it remains to see how logical their groupings can be. On the other hand, if you want to create some sort of privacy by obfuscation for yourself, what you can do is just visit a bunch of absolutely random websites over and over again, keep shuffling them over time, and then all the best to any FLoC system trying to put you into any sort of cohort.
Okay, so it allows you to sort of game the system a little bit more so that you can obviously ensure your privacy.
Potentially you can. That it comes with its drawbacks, because again, from your side you can do what you want, but you have no idea what FLoC is going to put you in, right? And then how it's going to target you. So that decision is out of your hand, then you may not know what the consequences of that are.
Okay, so the fact is that we don't really know. I mean, it potentially could be better for privacy, but we don't really know.
Yeah, correct, exactly, right? Because and that's what. So there's still a bunch of open questions, like we discussed. The other aspect, of course, is that this is right now something that only Google is pushing, right? It's not yet been declared as adopted as a standard, right? So whether Apple, Mozilla, etc. adopt it still remains to be seen, and until then you will still have multiple systems sort of working together. Of course, whenever Google rolls this out fully, right? This is still very much in an early test as of now.
Okay, fair enough. Rohan, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I'm just gonna say that if Apple actually says that we are going to be adopting this, I think I would genuinely be stunned, because I don't think it's as privacy preserving as it's being made out to be, and I think the fallout from this is something that can be quite. I just don't see a scenario where no cohorts are controversial ever. I I just don't think this is a privacy preserving method to go about advertising. Maybe there are other methods that are better. I am not sure, but this isn't it. And so those are my only thoughts.
I'm a little curious, right? If it doesn't further privacy, and it obviously sounds like a method that is worse off than individual targeting from an advertiser point of view, then who is this benefiting?
Google.
Yeah.
How exactly is it benefiting Google particularly?
Oh, so here's my sort of cynical hypothesis, right? Imagine you're Google, and you've sort of been controlling the web for the better part of the existence of the web, and you sort of realize that now you've got an influential competitor in Safari. People who are using iPhones are, of course, just richer than people who are using Android. I mean, if you had to sort of make a graph of how wealth is dispersed around the world, if you just had people using
There's Rohan making a FLoC of his own.
there you go, yeah. but but the general idea is that people who have more money are sort of using Apple devices, and generally, like, this is normally fine. Apple is also sort of the more privacy preserving browser, and it's actually trying to phase out third party cookies, and third party cookies have sort of been instrumental in making sure advertising stays as is. And because that's being phased out, they want a new system which is this. It's not perfect. Google will say it's a lot better than the alternative, and everyone should just get to this new standard as soon as it comes out. I think earlier they've talked about a timeline of 2 years for this to roll out. I think that might have been shortened after this proposal. I'm not exactly sure, but generally this idea here is to sort of benefit Google by placing it in a position to be the cutting edge leader for ad tech for decades to come, basically.
Yeah, and you have to look at it also in the perspective that Google Chrome as a browser, right, has a significantly larger share than all the other browsers, whether you're looking at desktop or you're looking at mobile, right? So this, in a sense, continues or further consolidates their position. One, in the sense that you're going to be more reliant on first party data or the data that Google has, and the fact that they can maybe even push this through as a standard just because of the amount of web browsing they control through Chrome.
No, that's fascinating. I mean, it's really interesting to understand how sort of the competitive sort of business aspect of this is actually what's driving this in some ways between these large tech firms as opposed to necessarily any of these other considerations. And I mean, I would be really interested to know what eventually advertisers would feel about these sort of changes that are coming out. I mean, any last thoughts, guys, before we wrap up?
I have a few. On that advertiser front, I don't think a lot of advertisers have enough power to get their thoughts into action as far as their interaction with Google is concerned. The other thing I would like to just add is to I was thinking about this while Prateek was talking. I think about this like a stack. So, for example, if let's say you want to search something on the internet, right? Either your phone's owned by Google. If it isn't owned by Google, the software on your phone's owned by Google. The search engine that you're going to use is going to be Google. If it's not, and let's say you're using an Apple iPhone and using Safari, the search engine is still likely going to be Google, unless you're one of those few people who use DuckDuckGo or so on. So, and the advertising industry that operates making sure when you browse the web it's subsidized. It's the exchange platform, the ad server, the ad bind tool is also controlled by Google. And so this is sort of exhibit J in how much power Google has to just be able to change the advertising standard of the internet and expect that most people are going to be okay with it. And to be fair to them, I don't think a lot of people have a choice. And so this is sort of just one way to make sure Google stays ahead of the curve and has a lot of market share going forward on this. So that's my closing.
All right, Prateek.
Yeah, so it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out in parallel with a lot of these conversations about how effective the sort of targeted advertising really is, right? Because there is pressure on companies, on advertisers to resort to less intrusive ways of advertising. Some of them are running their own independent experiments and figuring out that targeted advertising may or may not be giving them the kind of bang for the buck that they were promised, right? So it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out over the next couple of years.
All right. Thanks so much, guys. This has been a fascinating conversation. There's lots that I've learned, and I'm sure that lots that our listeners have also sort of will gain from this. Thank you so much once again. And folks, while you browse, always be conscious of what the cookies are doing. Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. We'd like to thank our sponsors on the network this week. Seth, thank you so much for sticking with us. On the Paisa Vaisa podcast, Anupam was joined by Sujata Alawat, who spoke about women's credit behavior and about improving credit scores for better financial health. Gauri Devi Dayal was joined by Barkha Dutt on This Round is on Me. She shared her thoughts on present-day media and journalism and some of her experiences from the days of her reporting. On The Habit Coach, Ashton talked about how meditation is like getting engrossed and absorbed into an activity where you are free of other thoughts and focus on just one thing. On Agra Station Adulthood, Ritasha and Ayushi were joined by Supriya and Priyanka Joshi for an honest and heartfelt conversation about life as a woman in the 2020s. On the Filter Coffee podcast this week, Karthik invited Bala Srinivas, who has been an active mentor in the startup scene in India, and they discuss its various aspects from funding to government support. Our traveling professor Cesar talks about this academic document called Statement of Purpose and helps us understand its concept and shares and some tips on how to draft it well. And with that, I hope to see you again next week.
पेश खिदमत है आपकी शान में हमारे अंजुमन से. Hi, I am Sadaf.
And I'm Arshit. खाने का इतिहास, economics, policy, psychology, सब है मेन्यू पे.
Only on the Nankari podcast every Wednesday, सिर्फ IVM podcast ऐप या वेबसाइट पर या फिर जहां से भी आप अपने पॉडकास्ट सुनते हो.